Alrighty, everybody. Hello, hello. Let me just make sure that my screens are shared, that everybody can see me and hear me okay. Should be fine. So, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So, we have been gathered here today, right, for a talk about multi-factor authentication, specifically how adversaries can still potentially bypass MFA. Now, before I dive into multi-factor authentication, I first want to take you onto a journey, so to speak, as to why we even need multi-factor authentication in the first place. So I'll be walking over a few things, but before I do, there's actually someone here that would like to say a few words. So if I would like to point your attention to the guest announcer of the day, which is this gentleman right here. So he has something to say. Let's hear what it is.
Hey there. Everyone, this is Dwayne Johnson. It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend John today. John is going to walk us through phishing attacks today and multi-factor authentication bypasses. I'm excited for this Sayans webcast, and I hope so. Are you? Let's go.
There you go. That was Dwayne The Rock Johnson announcing me. Now, obviously, not the real Dwayne The Rock Johnson. We cloned his voice. But it does give a little bit of an introduction, right, as to why MFA could potentially be bypassed. But I'll get more into that later today. All right, so let's talk about
Hey there.
let's talk about the agenda here. So first of all, what is phishing, right? We're going to take a look at, historically speaking, how we have progressed over the years trying to get initial access into modern web, not web, but modern enterprise environments. I'm going to talk to you about a little known trick, which is the good old tracking pixel. It's something that all red teamers should know about, and therefore, obviously, all blue teamers should be aware of as well. I'm going to talk a bit about credential harvesting, payload execution, and then we're going to talk a bit about multi-factor authentication, which is what lured you to attend this webcast in the first place, right? So, of course, no presentation nowadays in 2025 would be complete without a bit of AI sprinkled into it, right? So I asked our dear friend ChatGPT what exactly phishing is, and basically ChatGPT, feel free to read the answer, right? But in a nutshell, ChatGPT also kind of agreed that over time, right, adversaries are trying to breach an organization. There's only a finite way to do that from an adversarial perspective. Either you find a flaw on the external perimeter in some way, shape, or form, or you try and get initial access in some other way. And of course, unfortunately, even now, right, it has been like this for many years now, but even now, the weakest link for organizations are unfortunately still the human factor, right? So if we can somehow convince a human to do something that they shouldn't be doing, that's probably going to be a good way to get our initial access factor. Now, historically speaking, right, when we are doing social engineering attacks, we favor email because email is easy, right? You can send it very straightforwardly to victims. Nowadays, though, we are starting to see a little bit of a shift. I will walk you through what I mean by that in just a few moments. Now, of course, when we are doing social engineering, doing phishing, the actual objective here varies, right? It could be code execution, but it doesn't always have to be code execution. Could also be that we simply want to gather some intelligence, or maybe we are not really interested in getting remote code execution, but maybe we want credentials to, for example, log into Office 365 instead of getting code execution on the actual victim machine. And in some other cases, we might use social engineering as a way to get a persistent backdoor in the organization. I will walk you through what I mean by that today as well. So as already mentioned before I started talking, right? This is supposed to be an interactive webcast. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Zoom chat. I will probably not address them immediately while I am talking, but after the presentation is done, we can, of course, have some time to address some of your questions. So at any point in time, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is actually something that gets overlooked quite a bit, both by organizations as well as threat actors and even red teamers as well, which is the good old tracking pixel. Now, the good old tracking pixel, this is something that I also highlight in my SANS course, right? SEC 565, is a very undervalued piece of fingerprinting. What a tracking pixel effectively is it's just going to be a very small image that we embed into an email. Typically, that image is just going to be 1 pixel big, hence why we call it the tracking pixel, not the tracking image. Now, the tracking pixel itself is going to be fetched by your mail client when you open the actual email. This was originally, of course, not invented for adversaries or red teamers, but for marketeers, right? Marketeers wanted to have some way of tracking how effective their email marketing campaigns are, and they wanted to figure out how they could basically see whether or not someone opened the email, because there's a difference between opening the email and of course taking action, but at least then they had a metric. Okay, at least that this many people opened the email, so at least it was getting their attention, but then unfortunately it didn't convert to, for example, a sale, right? So how does that work? Well, again, we are embedding a image into our email. That email image is not, however, going to be inserted in the email directly, but instead is going to be referred by an external server that is hosting the image on the internet. So now when you open the email and your mail client allows for external image loading, the image is going to get fetched automatically by your mail client, and that is going to allow the web server to execute some JavaScript, which is going to allow us to fingerprint you. And there's actually some quite interesting things that we can get if we take a look at a tracking pixel. We get, of course, the date, time, right? So we see when exactly the user clicked on our email, but we also get an IP address, we get a geolocation, and even if they are using a laptop, we see the battery percentage, whether or not it's currently charging, yes or no. If they are using a horizontal or vertical screen, what the user time zone is, what their language is, whether or not they're using an incognito tab, if they're using an ad blocker, the screen size, even the browser, the operating system, whether or not you have a touch screen. So there's quite a bit of information there. Now, this is very interesting from a red team perspective and from an adversarial perspective as well, as we can use that information to secure our payload server. So next up, right, when we talk about some more phishing attempts, we are going to be talking about staging payloads, for example. Well, one thing that we want to do is we want to prevent people from just being able to download our payload if they are not actually the intended audience for our payload. For example, the internet is being scanned by quite a few things 24/7, right? So sandboxes, for example, threat intelligence providers, etc., might be trying to pull our payloads. If we, as a red team or an adversary, would basically try and get a connection with a particular victim without even doing anything malicious, simply trying to get them to open the email and loading the tracking pixel, well, we can use that information to secure our web servers. We actually have a full module on this particular topic in class as well, right? So this is really a very good first step at beginning a relationship with your client, right? You're trying to get your reputation up. You're trying to bypass the mail gateway. How do we do that? Well, our initial contact is not going to be malicious. We're not going to ask them to click on anything. We're not going to send an attachment. We're not going to do anything inherently malicious. The only thing we're going to try and do is try to get them to open the email, and maybe if we're lucky, our pretext might be successful enough that they will even send a reply. So a classic pretext could be you imposing as some type of vendor, selling maybe a firewall, or selling maybe a next generation router or switch or whatever it is that that particular organization might be interested in, simply trying to strike up a conversation, right? Now, at this point, there's really not that much risk yet for an organization, right? The most like the worst case scenario thing here would be information leakage. So there's not much maliciousness going on just yet. But if you really wanted to disable this behavior, you can actually do that from an organizational perspective by disabling external image loading. Unfortunately, though, in a lot of mail clients, image loading is enabled by default, right? So you might want to double check. So as I said, pretty straightforward to do because there's literally a external image protection setting in Outlook. So if you are a enterprise admin, for example, or a domain admin, and you want to push security against this type of attack, can simply enable this protection, which is going to disable the external image load. So this in itself, not that malicious just yet. But of course, that's not the only thing adversaries like to do, right? Another thing that adversaries might want to do is try and do credential harvesting. And credential harvesting can take many ways and many shapes and many sizes. We have what I like to call the lazy approach or the low effort approach, where we simply are going to go to a website that we want to clone, right? So a logon portal, for example, that could be Office, could be GitHub, could be maybe a third party login portal. Maybe your organization has some type of web application exposed to the internet that allows users to log in, right? Super straightforward way to clone is literally just go to any website, right click in your web browser, select save page, and then just fix all the CSS and JavaScript to point to the actual real web page. This is basically just cloning the HTML and is going to make sure that JavaScript and CSS, so your markup, the things that make your website look good, are still going to proxy to the actual legitimate website. Now, of course, there are some downsides to this. This only works on proper form pages, right, where username and password are on the same page. If there's some type of fancy shenanigans with JavaScript that allows users to simply insert their username, having to click next, and then there's another website that is going to pop up or another page that is going to ask for their password, then this is not really the best way of doing things. On top of that, there's also some manual labor involved, right? Because you still have to right click, you still have to modify the actual JavaScript and CSS to point to the actual real web server. And of course, and this is why we need multi-factor authentication, right? If multi-factor authentication is going to be enabled, well, then this particular technique is not very effective because at the end of the day, we are going to get a logon, we're going to get a password, but unfortunately, with a valid username and password, we wouldn't be able to log in because we are protected with multi-factor authentication. So credential harvesting, not bad, right? Of course, here we have introduced the manual approach. We could also put this in a framework. There are frameworks out there like GoFish, for example, which makes the life of an adversary or a red teamer in this case a lot easier because it has a lot of built-in functionality, allows you to clone websites out of the box. It allows you to use a tracking pixel like the one that we have talked about. It has SSL support, but you should also be aware of any indicators of compromise, right? Most of these frameworks out there will, of course, have been fingerprinted by blue teamers and by threat intelligence providers, etc. While it is fancy, right? It does give you a nice little dashboard where you can track how many people clicked on the things, how many emails were sent, how many people submitted their credentials. As I said, it also has indicators of compromise. For example, with GoFish, there is a mail header called the X mailer, which is actually going to show GoFish. So from a email proxy perspective, super trivial to detect phishing emails that are sent from GoFish if the actual adversary or red teamer didn't do their due diligence in reading through the source code and into figuring out how to patch these static IOCs out of their particular frameworks. So for this particular phishing attack, defenses are pretty straightforward as well. User awareness training being one of them, right? Make sure that your employees learn to recognize phishing emails and phishing URLs. Always make sure that they understand to check the actual URL where they are submitting credentials, that they check whether or not there is HTTPS enabled. And of course, if the website looks weird or it behaves strangely when you log in, for example, it gives you an error message or it redirects you to a 404 or something that is unexpected, well, then maybe you actually fell victim to one of these attacks. And then, of course, you want to start raising an alarm as soon as possible and changing your password if you still can. Otherwise, it might give an adversary a way into the organization. And then, of course, we have our enforced multi-factor authentication, right? That is why we are here. If you enable MFA on external facing applications, you are making your external perimeter more secure. Or are you? Right? We're going to be talking about that in just a few moments. Before we get there, though, there's some more phishing attempts here, right? So we could, for example, send an email with a malicious payload inside. This is, of course, going to try and force the user to execute the payload inside. It's a high risk, high reward level play, right? Because it's quite ballsy to include the actual payload in an attachment of an email. Nowadays, most organizations actually have pretty good detections against malware sent as an attachment. For example, a mail gateway that has a sandbox attached to it, which is automatically going to try and detonate your particular attachment in a sandbox environment to see, hey, is this malware or is this actually legitimate, right? So this type of attack, very straightforward to do. It doesn't require you to spin up any additional web servers or anything like that to host your payload, as you're simply attaching it directly to an email. But the effective rate here is quite low nowadays as well, because as I just mentioned, a lot of organizations have pretty robust detections against this type of attack. Then another way of doing things would be sending a link instead, right? This is a lot better in my opinion. That's also what we teach our students in class, right? Typically speaking, if we send that first email with a tracking pixel, we might have a user agent or we might have an external IP address that we could use as a guardrail in front of our payload mechanism. So here we, for example, are implementing a link-based phish attack, right? Where we are trying to convince someone to click on a link, but we can secure this link ourselves because we are in control of the actual infrastructure, right? So we could set up a payload server where we are hosting our malware, but we could use a reverse proxy, for example, that is filtering on an IP address or filtering on a user agent. If the IP address doesn't match or if the user agent doesn't match, we might redirect them to another web page. So of course, this bypasses things like sandboxes, this bypasses things like corporate proxies, etc. So here the defense starts to get a little bit more freaky, right? A little bit more flaky because, well, yes, mail gateways can block attachments, but links, not so much, right? So here you are very much going to be reliant on your corporate proxy. Hopefully, an adversary wasn't smart enough to, for example, age their domains appropriately, and they might be blocked by your corporate proxy. Otherwise, it's really a defense in depth kind of thing where if a user would actually download a payload from the internet, hopefully you have enough endpoints protections to block malware from executing. Think, for example, application control. Think, for example, an EDR or an antivirus, etc. These things are hopefully going to protect your organization against commodity malware. And then, of course, last but not least, again, user awareness is going to make the life of an organization a lot easier, right? Because we want to train our employees into recognizing social engineering attacks. Bring us to the meat of this particular webcast in the first place, right? Multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication is great because it combines something you know, right? So your password, for example, with something that you have. For example, your phone, right? Everybody nowadays has a smartphone. Well, most of you have a smartphone. So you have an authenticator app, for example, on your smartphone that you could use. Or maybe you have one of these little things right here, right? A little hardware token with a multi-factor authentication code on there as well. Or maybe you are in the government and you have a smart card authentication. Maybe you have a badge that you could use and insert that into your computer or your laptop, which is going to allow you to authenticate. Or maybe you have one of these modern laptops nowadays that have a thumbprint reader, right? Or Windows Hello, so your webcam, that is going to scan your face and is going to give you access to your particular account if they successfully identify you. Now, most of these multi-factor authentication vectors are secure, but not all of them are, right? First of all, addressing the elephant in the room, especially if a particular adversary would steal your laptop, for example, you might have multi-factor in the sense that you are using a smart card or that you're using biometrics. But most of the time, there's going to be a fallback mechanism into username password anyway, right? Because what if your webcam breaks? Or what if your thumbprint reader breaks? Or something didn't work and it doesn't scan your thumbprint anymore, or it doesn't scan your face anymore? Most computers nowadays are still going to have fallback mechanisms to just username password combinations. So if we have physical access, multi-factor authentication is really not that great because most of the time there is going to be a fallback mechanism. That said, multi-factor authentication is not always secure. And this was actually painfully obvious by a tweet not that long ago. I think it was last year by USAA. For those of you who are unaware, USAA is a financial institution and I think insurance as well for people in the US military, essentially. And they very proudly announced that they are now supporting multi-factor authentication using voice. So you can use your voice to authenticate yourself and basically access your bank account or your insurances or whatever. Unfortunately, this was very illy timed because I think 2 days or 3 days before or after, I don't remember exactly the timeline, they tweeted this. McAfee actually posted an article, it's not that long ago, where they said that artificial intelligence voice scams is now on the rise with one in four. So that's already 25%, right? Of adults being impacted in one way, shape, or form with artificial intelligence voice scams, right? And of course, we already had Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but I couldn't help myself, right? I also have this little guy right here.
I am Donald J. Trump. My voice is my passport. Verify me.
Donald Trump.
I am Donald J. Trump. My voice is my passport. Verify me.
Trying to identify himself with his passport, which is his voice. And if Donald Trump wasn't good enough, here we have Eric Cartman.
I am Eric Cartman. This is my voice. Verify me and respect me.
There you go. Now, obviously, the quality here of the voices are not necessarily foolproof, but I will be very honest. The amount of time that I took to clone these voices was very minimal as well. I literally did it in a whim because originally I wasn't planning to add these slides in the presentation. So about 10 minutes before the presentation, I actually was cloning these voices. So not very big effort here. And of course, that also shows in the voice quality. But to be very honest with you, if you take a bit more time, if you are massaging the model with the correct voice, you have a lot of high quality recordings of that particular individual, it's going to start sounding a heck of a lot more convincing. So unfortunately nowadays, right, a lot of social engineering attacks are starting to become more about phishing people instead of phishing people. So literally using the phone instead of your actual email. And this can get actually quite scary quite fast. In fact, you can, with pretty minimal effort, if you know what you're doing, set up your own voice center where you can start cloning people's voices with maybe 30 seconds of audio. But what's even more freaky is that you can hook this up into a call center, for example, using voice over IP telephony. We could actually start spoofing people's number. And yes, most countries out there have protections against number spoofing. But as it turns out, those protections are actually not sufficient. I was actually able to spoof numbers of every single country in the world, with exception of two. One of them was Belgium, right? Very strangely. And the other one was actually a country somewhere in Africa, also very weirdly. So that being said, the US, the UK, France, Germany, you name it, all of these particular regions are still vulnerable to number spoofing attacks. Even with stir and shaken, which are protection mechanisms in the US, it doesn't matter. If you have a SIP trunk, which is lenient enough, if you can find a shady provider, doesn't matter. Whether or not you're using stir shaken, you're still going to be able to get your number spoofed. So imagine that you are a parent, you have a child, right? Someone through social engineering or through OSINT figures out through a data dump, for example, not that long ago, I think 5 years ago or something, Facebook had a giant data leak with millions of people being exposed, their first name, last name, address, phone number, etc. So let's say that you're a parent and you have a kid who's a teenager, for example. If an attacker can identify you being a parent, identify the kid, identify your first name, identifies the kid's last name, first name, identifies both of your phone numbers. Well, now an adversary can try online, maybe TikTok, because nowadays all teenagers have TikTok, right? Or maybe Instagram stories or YouTube videos. If they can somehow find a recording of your kid talking for at least 30 seconds, which is not that long, but at least 30 seconds, they can now spoof your child's number, spoof or clone their voice, and start calling you. It's going to appear as your kid's phone number, and it's going to sound as your kid's. Now, if we then have a convincing pretext like, hey, mom, or hey, dad, I'm in a bit of a jiffy here. I mean, I need some money, blah, blah, blah. Something happened. I don't know what, right? I would have to think about the pretext longer than this. This is literally on the fly. Can you send me some money on my, I don't know, bank account, PayPal, whatever it is here, or maybe, I don't know, recharge my phone or whatever, something to try and convince you to either send the money in some way, shape, or form, or divulge interesting information that an adversary can use later in a follow-up attack. Well, things like this are starting to get a lot more frequent and a lot more scary as well. Remember that I told you, or that I showed you, that McAfee article where we said 1 in 4 was impacted? Well, this was about a year ago now. So I can only imagine that that number actually went up over time. So how do we actually bypass multi-factor authentication? Well, we actually already talked about one bypass, right? If we can clone a voice and the quality of the voice was good enough, we can actually fool voice-based multi-factor authentication. Makes a lot of sense. If we can basically make anybody say anything, then we can make them say passphrases, which is going to give us access to their account, again, provided that the model is strong enough to make a high quality replica of your voice. Other things that can bypass multi-factor authentication is, for example, a overly permissive application in Office 365. Now, most organizations nowadays are using Office 365. It's not a secret. Most organizations are using that nowadays. Where people standards used to use Exchange a few years ago, they have now all transitioned into Office 365. Now, Office 365 is quite interesting because it's cloud-based, so that means that your organization has some type of Azure or Entra ID tenants. Now, if your organization has an Entra ID tenant, that actually opens the organization up to a few attacks. One of these attacks is the invalid or overly permissive Office 365 application. Every single user that is currently enrolled in an Azure tenant, so that could be one of your internal employees, but could also be someone that has their own Entra ID or Azure tenant, right? Because they literally bought a license by Microsoft, can start creating Office 365 applications. Now, Office 365 applications are using or leveraging what we call the Graph API in the background. And the Graph API is the underlying protocol, essentially, that is being used by Azure. So think SharePoint, think OneDrive, think OneNote, all of these things, even email, right? All of these things can be queried and modified using the Graph API. So an Office 365 application can actually be configured to request quite a bit of intrusive permissions. Think, for example, reading and writing emails, reading files, writing files, reading contacts, right? Users have to accept these permissions after they log on. And once they have logged on and they accept the application, the adversary gets a refresh token that they can use to act on behalf of the user that accepted the application. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, we need to have our own Azure tenant, right, where we can register a malicious application. So here I created a little test tenant and I made it obvious that this is a malicious tenant, right? I called it hackerman at totallylegitcorp.onmicrosoft.com. Right? Step 2 would be, okay, now that we have a tenant, we have to create our own application. So here, once again, I'm making it super obvious, right? Totally legit Office 365 updater application. And the clue of the story, which is why this is successful, is we are ticking this little box right here. Accounts can use this in any Azure AD directory. So this is going to be a multi-tenant application, which means I'm developing this in my own environment, but this application is intended to be shared with other organizations as well. And here I'm redirecting the URL. Since I'm doing a demo here, I'm redirecting it simply to localhost, which is going to be the actual endpoint that receives the tokens of employees that are actually going to accept this application. So the Graph API allows us to get a lot of permissions, including email addresses, but also giving us access to all the files that a user can access, allowing us to write and read emails of the users, send emails as that particular user, override email inbox settings, sign in and read user profiles, etc. So quite a few interesting things from an adversarial perspective. Now, there are toolkits out there, completely open source, that allows us to basically piggyback on these applications. One of the tools out there is Office 365 Toolkit by MDSec or O365 Stealer by Altered Security. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating an application and I will use this particular application to host it. And here you can actually see what's going to happen. I'm going to send a link to a user. And if you take a good look at this link, you're going to see that this link is a legitimate Microsoft link. So login.microsoftonline.com, which is an actual legitimate Microsoft website where we are trying to basically accept this particular application with this client ID. So when a user would click on the link, so here is my other test tenant, this is the actual legit tenant, they would get a screen that looks a little bit like this. Now, here we make it super obvious that this is not legit, right? But we could make this sound and look a lot more legitimate. We can add a little icon here. We could change the name to actually something that sounds legitimate, right? And the clue is here, right? The culprit is this right here, the access that the actual application is trying to get. So if you read all of this, you can see, okay, this application tries to get a lot of data. Unfortunately, a lot of users don't read all of this, right? They just click accept, and once it's approved, it's game over, right? So what happens in the background? We get the access token here, and eventually, once we have the access token, we could start doing a lot of evil shenanigans, right? So here we could start enumerating a user's email, trying to look for passwords in the email, etc. So what exactly are the downsides, right? What is the worst case scenario of someone that has a malicious Office app? What is the worst thing that they can do? Well, they can start checking all the users in your tenants. They can start retrieving all the emails and sending emails by impersonating the user. They could start taking a look at all the files that are accessible by the user. So think files in SharePoint, but also in their own personal OneDrive as well. A lot of people actually sync OneDrive locally and in the cloud, right? So what this means is when you work on a document and you save it, it would automatically upload a copy in your online OneDrive, for example. But it also works the other way around, right? If you're editing a file in the cloud and you save it, it's going to be synced to your local system. So we could use this as a persistent backdoor. We could take a look at a OneDrive file, which is a Word file or an Excel file, and we could literally introduce a backdoor in the file by introducing a macro in the file, right? Either an Office macro through Word or an Office macro through Excel that is going to start launching shellcode, launching a command and control beacon, whatever it is that we're trying to do. And also, quite interestingly, we could use this to start scanning teams. And unfortunately, I can't see your faces, but if I would ask you to honestly raise your hands and be like, hey, have you ever shared sensitive information over Teams? Or maybe are saving sensitive information in your own OneDrive profile or on SharePoint? If you're honest, 90% of you are probably going to raise your hand and be like, yep, I've done this before, right? Now, how do we defend against this particular attack? Well, as it turns out, it's pretty straightforward to do because this was patched by Microsoft, right? Nowadays, third-party Office 365 applications require an admin to review the actual application before accepting it. However, there are some exceptions to this rule. Any Office 365 application that was built before November 2020 is exempt of this particular patch. So if you are a red teamer or maybe a threat actor and you have a tenant that has a Office 365 application that was developed before November 2020, happy days for you, because you can still continue to use this TTP as this particular patch is useless if your application is older than November 2020. Now, if you create a tenant, an Office 365 application in the same tenant, right? So if you, for example, already compromised a user, and then you are creating an application as that user for that internal tenant, that also bypasses this particular defense mechanism. So if you're sending your Office application to another employee, for example, and they accept, congratulations, you can also use this. Verified applications will also bypass this particular admin approval process. But to get verified, you actually need to submit your app to the MS partner, so the Microsoft Partner Center, which is going to, of course, audit your application. So if you're using it for shady shenanigans and you're not hiding it very well, you're not going to get verified. But if your app actually does some legitimate things and you're hiding your illegitimate things on top of legitimate things, you might actually get your application verified as well. Now, there's still another thing that you could do, which is simply don't allow third-party applications in the first place. You can set this organizational wide. So if you are a global administrator, you could basically say nobody is allowed to give consent to a third-party application. Right, so I have a little demo here end to end on what that looks like. So let me see if I can run this real quick. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm logging in on my own tenant, right? You can see that right here. We have this Hackerman tenant, the Totally Legit Corp. And you're going to see that I'm creating a new application. I once again am calling it something totally obvious. And of course, once again, I'm using this multi-tenant approach to make sure that the app is multi-tenant so that I can actually send this to a victim. Right? As I said, this is an internal demo, so I'm using localhost as a fallback mechanism. In reality, this would be a attacker-controlled system on the internet, right? And now I'm going to get a application client ID and a secret, which I'll have to fill out to my 365 stealer. So I'm basically just copy pasting the secret strings that I get from my own tenant. So this is all attacker controlled, right? This is not yet on the victim. Basically, and here I'm going to start adding permissions for my application, right? So this is where the danger lies. I'm going to give myself enumeration rights on the victim. I'm going to allow myself to read and write to the user's email, send emails on behalf of the actual victim, give myself access to the OneNote of the victim as well. And then I'm going to host my actual payload on a legitimate Microsoft URL. And now I'm browsing to that legitimate URL, and I'm going to now authenticate as my legitimate user. And you're going to see that my legitimate user is going to do username, passwords, but also multi-factor authentication, right? So here you can see I'm trying to sign in. It prompts me for my multi-factor authentication token. So I look for my phone, type in the number 41. And once I'm authenticated, so the actual attack happens after successful authentication, you can see that we get this super legit application that is trying to request permissions, right? So if I now accept this, then you can see that on my attacker side of the house, we get a lot of information here, which ultimately is going to leak an access token in my toolkit right here. And we can now use that access to start enumerating Active Directory, well, Azure Active Directory. So you can see that there are some other users that we could potentially social engineer into accepting our application. And eventually we'll also use the email permissions to start taking a look at the user's email. So that's what I'm doing here, right? Searching into all victims' emails, looking for the string password. So this would give me all the emails that have a password inside of it. And here we can see that we do have this passwords inside of the actual email right there. So this is one of the easiest ways of doing multi-factor authentication. The only thing that you need is a Azure tenant, which allows you to create your own Office 365 application. And then you'll also need to get verified, or your application needs to be older than 2020. So probably if you're just finding out about this attack. That's not going to be the case. So you might have to create a legitimate app that does some illegitimate things, get yourself verified, right, to bypass that admin protection setting. Now, another way of doing multi-factor authentication bypasses, and this is one of my favorite ways, this is what I use personally in a lot of my red team engagements, is device code flow abuse. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with device code authentication, but essentially, if you have a smart TV, for example, and you're trying to log in to Netflix or Disney Plus or Formula One TV or any other application that requires you to insert a username and a password. Well, then you probably also know that it's quite annoying to use your remote control to start, going over the on-screen keyboard trying to insert your passwords and your username. So to facilitate this, nowadays we have what we call device code authentication flows, which is basically going to be you browsing to a website, or in this case, opening an application on your smart TV. It's going to open up and it's going to display to you a few numbers. And these numbers you have to insert in your own phone, so in your app or on the internet. You type in the numbers that you see on your television, you click OK, and automatically it's going to log you in on your system, right? So that's not just for Netflix, that's not just for Disney Plus. As it turns out, Microsoft also has device code authentication flows implemented. And the URL is super straightforward, and it's a legitimate URL, right? Microsoft.com/device login. Super straightforward. Now, how does this get abused? Well, an attacker is going to initiate a device code flow using a registered app or a known client ID. I'm going to talk more about a known client ID in just a minute. Then the user, or at least the attacker, is going to use a tool to basically generate a device code for you, and is going to try and social engineer you to insert that particular device code on your site. If you are inserting that device code, you are going to essentially have the same result from an adversarial perspective as the malicious Office 365 app, which is going to allow you to get a refresh token to start authenticating on behalf of the user towards any Entra ID resource. Even if that user has multi-factor authentication, it doesn't matter because the MFA session was already established. Now, it's actually quite interesting because in Azure or in Entra, you have this thing called conditional access policies. So you can basically have things in there that say, hey, if if a device is trying to authenticate, but they don't have, let's say, CrowdStrike installed, or they don't have a VPN installed, or they are not in the US, then we are blocking that device from accessing resources. Well, as it turns out, there's actually something quite interesting. Every time a Office application, well, technically that's the incorrect term. It's actually an Entra application. Every time an Entra application is published, it's actually hard-coded. The client ID is hard-coded for that particular application. And as it turns out, there's a few hard-coded applications out there. Let me quickly bring up a little thing here. I thought I was in the slides, but apparently I did not put it in there. See if I can find it really quick. If not, I'll just continue. No, can't seem to immediately have it. Let me check one more thing. Oh yeah, never mind. Found it. Here it is. So Daft Hack, or Bo Bullock, very talented hacker, actually has a list of hard-coded client IDs that are published by Microsoft, right? So these IDs, once again, are well known, they are hard-coded, and they are not going to change, right? So we could create a device code authentication flow by spoofing this client ID. It doesn't matter from Microsoft's perspective, as these applications can be installed on every single Azure tenant, right? So this actually makes sense. And as it turns out, there is one of these clients, which is the Intune client. And if you take a look at a tweet of Dirk-Jan, very talented also, red teamer that is primarily doing research in the cloud, you can see that there is this Intune company portal app, which has a undocumented, hard-coded exclusion to conditional access policies. So basically, if you're creating a token with this client ID, you are always going to be able to use that token to authenticate to Entra, even if your device is not compliant. So how does that work in practice, right? What does a device code phish look like? Well, here we have a little demonstration courtesy of Black Hills Info Security, very well-known consultancy. What we are doing here is we are going to generate a device code token. Takes a little bit of time to actually get that token, but you're going to see, we're going to send an email. There you go. So we have this Microsoft device token, which is going to have a particular code in there. So basically, this would be a phishing email that we are sending to a victim, right? To sign in, use the web browser, go to Microsoft.com device login, and enter this code to authenticate. Sincerely, Microsoft Device Security Team, for example. Very basic pretext, but you could make this as complex as you want. So a user enters the code in here, is going to get prompted to authenticate. And in this case, we are already authenticated, but if multi-factor authentication would be happening, then the multi-factor authentication prompt would first appear here. The user would have to solve it, and then they would continue. And you can see here on the attacker side of the house, we once again get access tokens that we can now start using with things like road recon tools, graph runner, etc., to bypass multi-factor authentication once again. And then one of the things that is not on the slide, but that I would like to talk about as well, is, for example, multi-factor authentication bombing. If you still have an application that is simply sending a push notification to a victim or to a user when they are logging in to basically say, hey, is this you? Yes or no? Without asking for any type of code, just a yes or no prompt on your phone. Well, this type of multi-factor authentication is actually super straightforward to bypass as well. Because what we could do here is literally just spam the user until they ultimately are going to say yes. So if we somehow guessed the username and password and the only thing missing is the multi-factor authentication prompt, we could simply try to log in as that user over and over and over again, resulting in tens, maybe even hundreds of authentication requests on their phone. And eventually, I can guarantee you, if you get a pop-up on your phone and you say no, it pops up again, you say no, it pops up again, you say no, it pops up again, you said no. After about 5 times, maybe 10 times, you're going to give up and you're eventually are going to say yes. So super straightforward way of bypassing multi-factor authentication that way as well. And then, of course, we have text-based multi-factor authentication as well. Again, not in the slides, but I want to talk about it too. If you have a multi-factor authentication which is sending a text message to you, right? If you get a text on your phone, well, that's not a very secure way of doing multi-factor authentication either. Because what this allows attackers to do is a SIM swap attack. Depending on the country that you're in, it might be super straightforward to social engineer a call center employee. Some countries out there allow you to request a new SIM card on behalf of a user. And as it turns out, this attack has become even more easy than it once was, because prior to a few years ago, we had physical SIM cards, right? You had to actually go to a store or wait until someone sends you an actual physical SIM card to insert into your phone. Nowadays, though, we have this concept of an eSIM, right? An electronic SIM card. So it is really as straightforward nowadays as calling to a call center, right? Your ISP or your telco provider, and say, hey, I am this person. I'm in a bit of a jiffy here. My phone got stolen. I just got a new phone. I'm on a holiday right now, right? I'm not at home. I don't have anything with me, but I can't use my phone, right? I really need to use my phone because I need to get access to my bank accounts, whatever. Because by the way, most people nowadays are using online banking, right? So we all have an online app, right? So I really want to use my phone, but it requires me to have multi-factor authentication using my phone number. Could you please send me a new eSIM so that I can have my old number back on my new phone? You'd be surprised how easy it is to get an eSIM very straightforwardly sent to you. Even in the same pretext, you could say, okay, hey, by the way, I can't access my old account, my old email account right now, because again, requires multi-factor authentication, which I can't use right now because I have a new phone. So could you please send the eSIM to a new email account? This is the new email address. It would be very helpful. You would save my day, you would save my life, whatever, right? And I can guarantee you, not everybody, but at least a few phone providers will fall for this, will send an eSIM to a new email address on behalf of a user that you aren't, allowing the attacker to, of course, hijack your phone number, which means any multi-factor authentication that is being done by mobile phone is now under full control of an adversary as well. So pretty scary stuff. And then, of course, the most straightforward way of multi-factor authentication would be using a proxy-in-the-middle attack, right? Things like Evilginx, for example. Because let's face it, multi-factor authentication is great, but multi-factor authentication only protects the authentication flow. That's why we call it multi-factor authentication. Once the multi-factor authentication is done, the application behaves as a normal application, right? So a web application typically has session management. So we have a JWT token or a bearer token or a cookie that is basically keeping track of our state, track of our session. So if we're already authenticated, an attacker simply needs to steal our already authenticated session and simply piggyback on that particular approach. And this is what you see right here, right? So here on the left, I am currently logged on Twitter. On the right, I am not logged on Twitter, or I'm going to log out on Twitter at least. Because right now you can see that I am in fact logged on, but here I am no longer logged on. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm using an incognito tab. So this is a new Twitter tab. I have this particular cookie right here that I'm simply going to inject into my browser session here. The auth token, copy paste. Yep. And I'm simply going to refresh my web browser, and you're going to see, ta-da, automatically logged in as my account, right? So even with multi-factor authentication enabled on my Twitter account, doesn't matter if an attacker can simply dump a cookie of an already connected session, then it's super straightforward to just inject it into our own web browser and to actually do that and piggyback on our own authenticated session. So the easiest way, if you don't want to use a malicious Office 365 app or device code phishing, would be using Evilginx. Evilginx is a proxy-in-the-middle framework, which we are also leveraging in a lot of red team engagements. I actually have a lab that you could do as well. It's a lab that is a bonus lab in SEC 565 as well. So you can actually take a look at how that works. It's fully interactive. It's self-guided. It's also locally hosted, so you don't have to do anything. The only thing that you need is a Docker enabled system, right? So a system that can run Docker containers. That's pretty much it. You run the Docker container, you follow the lab guides, and that's as straightforward as it is. So that is basically going to be, in a nutshell, how we are doing multi-factor authentication and how we can bypass multi-factor authentication as well. I think this is pretty well timed, right? Because we have an hour, and I think this is literally 1 hour. So there you go. That was the presentation on multi-factor authentication. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you are not too scared now, right? But yeah, that's pretty much it. So if anybody has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. And if not, then hopefully you can all check out the lab guides in your own time to play around with an MFA bypass yourself. And yeah, maybe I see some of you in SEC 565 or in 699 because those are the classes that I teach. So once again, thanks for your attention and hopefully speak to you all at some point somewhere in the future as well.